Matthijs joined the University of Lincoln in September last year as Professor of Responsible Management. Before joining Lincoln, Matthijs worked as a reader at the University of Bath, and before at the VU University in Amsterdam, and Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, of course. Matthijs obtained his PhD cum laude in 2009 on his research about psychological contracts of older workers from VU University in Amsterdam. Matthijs' research interests concern dignity in the workplace, ageing workers, psychological contracts, individualization of work, workplace flexibility, and the impact of fictional narratives on employee behavior. He has written 3 books, one of which will be published in June this year, and includes new theoretical perspectives on dignity in the workplace. Matthijs has published in total more than 70 publications on these topics, and he's also on the editorial board of journals such as International Journal of HR, Work, Aging and Retirement. Matthijs collaborates with researchers across the world, including Chile, Pakistan, the USA, South Africa, China, the Netherlands, Belgium and Switzerland. So, ladies and gentlemen, I present Professor Matthijs Bal.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here and to hold this inaugural lecture here in Lincoln, which is entitled Workplace Dignity as Alternative Paradigm in Organization Studies. So today I will be talking primarily about my new research stream on workplace dignity. But before delving into workplace dignity, I think this inaugural lecture gives a nice opportunity to talk a little bit about the background of how I came to develop new perspectives on dignity in the workplace. So, in short, there's basically 5 things that I will be talking about in the next 40 minutes. First of all, why are we actually here? Second, on aging workers, employment relationship, individualization, a bit of around my research that I've been doing over the last 12 years or so. Delve into a little bit of societal impact on organizational behavior, after which I introduce dignity in the workplace and perspectives on, okay, but what can dignity actually offer us as researchers, but also as just people in the workplace or beyond that. So first, let's start with the question, why are we here? Which of course is a very philosophical question, but also a very practical question. Because it is about the question, how does a person move from psychology into responsible management? If you look at a curriculum within the psychology degrees, there's not much about responsibility or responsible management. So how do you move from psychology into responsible management? So that process started basically in 2005 when I commenced my PhD research, which was basically on the psychology of the older worker. I will tell a little bit more about that in a moment. So, but over time, I increasingly experienced a dissatisfaction with psychological discourse, which eventually led me to doing research and thinking about the importance of workplace dignity. So let's start with the psychology of the older worker. In 2005, I started my PhD research on this topic, and at that time we knew what was happening. We knew a little bit about the consequences of the aging workforce and aging population, and this is just a figure which shows the aging population, and especially here this figure is interesting. So just to show that we still tend to neglect the impact of the aging population. In 2050, let's say 1/3 of the population will be older than 60 years in Europe. So this poses enormous challenges for organizations and governments in terms of, okay, what are we actually going to do if we think about working, if we think about retirement and all of those topics. And this is also quite a nice figure which shows how the population, in this case in the US, has changed over the last 50 years or so and will change over the next 30 years or so. Basically from a pyramid into a rectangular shape. So the population will change dramatically. And this we knew in 2005, of course. So that is why we had to ask ourselves, okay, what can we do about the aging workforce? How can organizations manage this problem? And I deliberately use these words. So then we talk about solutions. What can we actually do when we talk about the aging workforce? Now, first of all, what governments do is basically increase the retirement age, which is a very simple measure to make it financially unattractive to retire early. And what you see, and this is the case, this is the example of the UK here, is that indeed over the last 10 years or so, the average age that people retire from work is increasing a bit. So this is basically what governments do, how economists tend to think about the problem of the aging workforce. But then for us psychologists, there's other questions that are, of course, much more interesting. Because this question is about, okay, when people have to work longer and continue working beyond their retirement, how are we going to do that? What is actually happening? How do these jobs look like? And so this is basically the view that many people still have, is that we basically all become Rolling Stones. So we just pretend that we're still in our 20s and we continue to sing Painted Black. So how many times have we already sung this song, and how many times are we still able to sing this with the same kind of enthusiasm that we had when we first sang it, right? So are we all going to be Rolling Stones, just continue doing the same kind of thing over and over again, only until we are 70 instead of 58 or something? Now, of course, a psychologist has some more nuanced answers, and these are just some examples of publications of research that I have done over the last 12 years or so, one of which showing that it is so important that we take an individual approach. So when we are talking about how can we make sure that all the workers continue working in a healthy, motivated and productive way, we need an individual approach. But at the same time, organizations can also do a lot of things, such as implementing systems of career customization. So implement HR policies and practices which allow people to in a much more flexible way, continue working. Okay, so far so good. We're still within this psychological discourse. But, and then of course here comes the but. There's basically two problems with, and I can be self-reflective here of course, but I'm also talking about the wider literature about the aging workforce. There's two main problems, the business case and the retrospective nature of the research. So first of all, we have to think about the business case. So basically, in 2005, when I started my research, I went to organizations in these years, also during the crisis, I went to organizations and to talk about, can I do some research on all the workers in your organization? And then an HR director or a director in a firm would always ask me, yeah, but why should we invest in all the workers? Why should we invest in you doing research here? Can you show us what is the business case for all the workers? Then this was a question that we kept on hearing over and over again. Explain us the business case business case to invest in all the workers. And of course, this is a very limited kind of perspective if we're talking about all the workers. Because we know quite well that generally older workers are more expensive for organizations than younger workers. So why would they invest in older workers when they're just more expensive and at the same, for a much lower price, so to say, you can hire younger workers? And then to show the business case is not, of course, not something that is a task of an academic. But more relevant here is, of course, the underlying principle of the business case, the idea that employees are primarily instrumental to organizational goals. This is underlying the business case. The idea that employees are only interesting and relevant for organizations if they are able to contribute to organizational outcomes, most of the time narrowly defined within terms as shareholder value, organizational profitability, financial outcomes, etc., etc. The second problem concerns the retrospective nature. So basically what we're doing with our research is we collect a lot of data and we try to make up a picture of what is happening. And what we are then doing is predicting the past. We're trying to predict what has happened in the past, which is already difficult enough. But it does not say anything about the future, about how workplaces will be looking like in the future, how organizations can design organizations, practices, systems, structures, and so on, which are much more in a much better way, allowing all the workers to maintain or to maintain their motivation and so on. So the research that we are doing is very much reflecting on what has happened in the past, but it doesn't necessarily say something about the future. And more fundamentally, the question here around the problem of the older worker, how can we motivate the older worker, is not that relevant. There's more relevant questions that we need to ask. If we take into account that older workers are not just a problem, but also are symptomatic, so to say, of wider problems, how can we look at the symptoms without taking into account all of the factors that we are now seeing occurring in the workplace? So we all know about increasing inequality. We all know about unemployment and underemployment and zero-hour contracts and so on. Technology increasingly replacing jobs, outsourcing, for example, as a result of Brexit. Outsourcing again to Europe, which is nice for Europe, of course, but not so much for the UK. The idea that organizations continue to exist with the idea that profits are more important than people. The idea that exploitation is still very much a central element of organizational life, of production systems, of supply chains. The well-known notion now that organizations are a major contributor to environmental challenges, climate change. That wars are strongly related to organizational interests. So what we observe is a malfunctioning system, and we are focusing on the problem of the older worker, and we have to ask ourselves, but what is really happening here? So what is really happening here is about, we have to return to the basic questions. What are organizations for? Why do organizations exist? And what role do people play in organizations? And it is in those times of insecurity, not just job insecurity, but a more fundamental insecurity about values within society, that we have to return to these more basic questions. Why do organizations actually exist? And this is where, at this point, where we can start to talk about workplace dignity. Workplace dignity is not the same as human dignity. The concept of workplace dignity is all about the dignity not just of people, but the dignity of basically everything that is part of the workplace. So in my theory, I postulate that everything that becomes part of the workplace has dignity and should be treated with dignity. So it's not just about people having dignity, but it's also about animals, it's about resources, it's about land, it's about the environment, it's about material things, but it's also about immaterial things, such as finance, for example. The basic starting point of the theory is that all of these have their dignity. Now, from a more philosophical point of view, what I'm actually doing here is a combination of the classical Kantian approach, which I will discuss in a minute, with traditional Chinese approach, the Taoist approach towards dignity. So the Taoist approach says that everything that exists on the planet has dignity. Kantian approach is very well explaining how dignity manifests and how we can deal with dignity. But first of all, then why dignity? Why do we need dignity as a sort of an additional framework, a new framework for understanding what is happening in the workplace? Now, just first two examples of why dignity is important. The left is a very well-known classical picture of the unemployed, right? So, what's happening now in the workplace? What you see is that organizations, they can lay off a group of people in order to survive or in order to increase their shareholder value. So what's happening here, you see it over and over again, banks, financial institutions, manufacturers and so on, they're laying off a number of people, and what they're actually doing is they justify those mass layoffs on the basis of, okay, if we are not doing this, then the whole organization will go bankrupt. And so we are sacrificing basically an X amount of people in order to survive. And extending that logic, what you see now is that organizations say, well, we need to increase our shareholder value, and therefore we are laying off people. So there's some justification of this logic. But that does not take away, of course, that those who are being laid off are likely to feel their dignity as being violated. So no matter what kind of justification there is, they still feel that dignity is being violated. And this is just a way of understanding what is really happening here in the experiences of people. Another example is the picture on the right, which is almost unrecognizable in terms of it's almost an abstract picture. But of course we can very well see these are chickens which are being used for mass production and then for mass consumption in some, for example, for some company as KFC, where they can then make some chicken wings with it or whatever kind of cheap meat. So we can clearly see from this picture already that this is not a natural thing. This is not how it's supposed to be. And what is actually happening here is that we have quite an intuitive sense of the dignity of these chickens being violated. So what is our duty here? Now, two examples to take it further. The first, on the left, of well-known dignity violations. The picture on the left is is a picture of the Foxconn factories in China. So the Foxconn factories in China, they produce the iPhones. Perhaps some of you who carry an iPhone in the pocket will also be aware that these are being produced in China, in these Foxconn factories. And what we see here is the suicide nets. So the working conditions of the people working in these factories were so poor that people were jumping from the buildings, the employees were jumping from the buildings. And so what did the organization do? They installed these suicide nets to catch the people who were jumping from the buildings. Now, the problem here is that we see not only dignity being violated, but another kind of a level of humiliation, a further violation of the dignity of the workers here. Because instead of doing something around the working conditions of the employees, you see these suicide nets, which are of course a very cynical way of dealing with, for example, working conditions. But another example, which I think is quite interesting, is a more local one, and that's the Primark here, the local Primark in Lincoln. Primark is quite an interesting example to analyze dignity. Because what's happening in the Primark is that people, mostly people who don't have a lot of money to spend, they go to the Primark to buy very cheap clothing. It's very cheap there. Jeans for less than £10, for example. It's very cheap. So the first dignity violation, of course, that you can observe there is that the question of the true price of these jeans. So let's say jeans of £10 is too cheap. A jeans cannot be £10. So the true price of the jeans is of course being paid by all the people along the supply chain. For example, the people in Uzbekistan working in the plantations in slavery, or people in the factories in Vietnam working in such poor conditions and being paid so poorly that they are actually paying the true price of the clothing. But that's not all. Because at the same time you see people working in these shops probably on 0-hour contracts, so the people themselves working in these shops are not treated that well. And it also extends, of course, to the consumer. Because what's happening additionally, and this is Primark, which is just another chain in the high street. The high street here is filled with chain stores, chain restaurants. So what is happening there? People spend their money there, and the profits that are being generated are being sucked out of Lincoln into, of course, some tax haven, such as the Netherlands or the Cayman Islands, these kind of banana republics, as we call it. So instead of spending their money locally, and consequently that the money is being reinvested locally again, the money is being sucked out of the regions and extending as well the further impoverishment of poorer regions. So we can analyze dignity being violated in various instances here. So what is dignity actually? Dignity means that everything in the workplace has an intrinsic, inviolable worth that should be respected, protected, and promoted. Now, the idea here is that when we enter the workplace, let's take the example of becoming an employee for an organization. The idea of dignity here is that this entry to the workplace is not just a neutral act. And this is something that we have to realize. So on the one hand, when we enter the workplace, we have various goals. For example, financial goals, we want to earn a living. We also have social goals, we want to interact with other people, and so on and so on. Personal goals, and so on. So we have a lot of goals when we enter the workplace. But at the same time, this entry is not just a neutral act, but it carries specific duties. And this is basically the Kantian approach of defining what dignity actually is. So as I said, the Taoist perspective tells that everything that exists has dignity, and then Kant, philosopher Immanuel Kant, explains, okay, but how does dignity actually manifest in social life? Well, that is through the idea of duty. So let's take a bit of a more scientific perspective on it and look at the model. Now, at the top, we can see, okay, we start from the point where we accept that workplace dignity is something that exists. Kant explained very well that it is workplace dignity first is being brought about through the individual duties that people experience when they enter the workplace. So these duties pertain to the dignity of other people, but also the duty to the duty of the dignity towards ourselves, the dignity of animals, environment, material world. So basically, as I said, everything that's in the workplace. But then the question is, how do these duties actually manifest? How do we become aware of what our duties are? So when we enter the workplace, we have a lot of ideas and attitudes and intuitions about what our duties are. But how are these communicated? Well, there is the role of the dialogue. So when we enter the workplace, we start to interact with other people. So the idea of dialogue is central to how dignity is being is manifested in the workplace. First at the one-to-one basis, when we talk to another person on a one-to-one basis about, okay, what is actually dignity meaning in this particular context, in this particular situation. And then it can become collective, where we start to talk, for example, within an organization about, okay, what is actually our idea of what dignity is as an organization. And also beyond the organization, when we are within our communities, with other stakeholders such as governments, councils, etc., customers. When we're starting to talk about, okay, what does dignity actually mean within the situation? And so how can we strive towards respecting, protecting, and promoting workplace dignity? And then finally, this may result in various outcomes. And I've selected 4 here very conveniently because they all start with the I. So it's the 4 I's. Of course, there's probably more outcomes, but this sounds nice. So what we see, what I started with, the business case, which is a central problem in organizational life. If we talk about dignity, it's not about how people are being instrumental to the organizational process, but it turns it around and says, okay, the point of where we start is where we talk about, okay, how can we increase the dignity within the workplace of people, but not only people, also animals, and so on and so on. Because of the central idea around the dialogue as being central part of how dignity is manifested in the workplace, it also counteracts the well-known concern of the individualization of the work, of society, of work itself. So it is through the dialogue where we get in contact with other people, where we are interacting with other people, that we lay the foundation of what dignity actually is, not only for ourselves, but also for other people. Inequality, another one. So we are not actually concerned about inequality, but we are concerned about the rising inequality. Very few people debate the concept of inequality itself, because a level of no inequality, which means total equality, is resonating too much as communism, and people don't like it. So it is about how can we find a dignified way of distributing inequality in society. So we may have an intuition that a banker who is making £2 million a year, that is not a dignified way of treating people or rewarding people in the workplace. But then the question is, but how? What is a more dignified way of rewarding people? And finally, insecurity. So this is not just about job insecurity. This is also about the more fundamental ideological insecurity that you see now being so prominent. So basically, we all know nowadays that capitalism and liberal democracy are walking on their last legs. So it's over, we know that. But then it is the fundamental problem here is that we feel this fundamental insecurity about, okay, but what next? What else? If an organization does not exist just for profits, what can we replace it with? Well, dignity can offer just a first perspective on, okay, there is an alternative. And now coming back to the problem of the older worker, dignity also offers another perspective on this very issue. So it's not about the business case for older workers. It's about, okay, what is actually a dignified way towards aging workers and more generally an inclusive workplace? That means that everybody could or should deserve a place to work, to contribute, etc. So we don't have to start from the point where you have to show your own contribution to the organizational outcome, but we reverse it and say, okay, the organizations also exist to increase the dignity in the workplace. But of course, this is not some way in which we can say, okay, we are all becoming some kind of charitable organization, contributing to social value and so on and so on. It's of course all about balance here. Organizations can only exist when they're financially viable, that's clear. Right? But what you can see now is this balance is being shifted, has been shifted for a long time. So it's about rebalancing. So what I propose here is that organizations can function on the basis of the dignity question. So it is about, in every act, when we have to take a decision within organizational life, we have to ask ourselves the question, okay, to what extent does our action lead to violations of dignity, or vice versa? How can our actions contribute to greater dignity in the workplace? And if there is a chance of a dignity violation, is there a way in which we can resolve this? Now, a possible critique against this is, of course, that it sounds like somewhat a utopian theory, where you say, okay, we talk about the dignified organization, where everything is going well, where everyone is striving towards greater dignity, and so on and so on. And of course, that's not the case. It's not a utopian theory where we are talking about some end station of the dignified organization. But it starts from the point where we know a lot about, for example, duties from previous research. So, for example, if you look at the literature on psychological contracts, we very well know that when people enter the workplace, they have, they experience strong duties to be a good employee, to contribute to organizations, to help other colleagues. We know from a lot of research within organizational behavior and HRM that when people enter the workplace, they have these strong duties. But it is about refocusing, putting it in a dignity paradigm through which we can establish a theory. So, this is a first step towards dignity in the workplace. There is some research about it. We do know that people have experience about dignity violations and also have experiences about how their dignity is being earned and rewarded. But there's a lot of research that needs to be done. For example, how individual employees experience dignity in the workplace. How dignity is being communicated, how we can talk about it, what the role is of workplace democracy as a more formal way of allowing dignity to be implemented within organizational life. How structures and cultures can contribute to dignity. How dignity can be something around, that can be also part of corporate governance, of governance models within organizations. And how dignity can be truly implemented within organizations. And over the last months, I've seen these questions being asked in the business school here. And we're talking about those questions, and we're starting new research projects around these questions. So there are first steps towards answering. So the final thing I want to say about dignity is that it may sometimes sound as a somewhat utopian ideas, but as always, research and science is always lagging behind reality. So these are just two examples of organizations where we clearly see that dignity is already being part of organizations. So organizations are doing remarkably similar things. Common Land, a Dutch organization, SECAM, an Egyptian organization. So Common Land is an organization which has worked, for example, in China and also in Spain, where you see that due to intensive farming, land is becoming more and more desert-like. So because of the exhaustion of the land due to intensive farming, deserts appear and are increasing. So Common Land is actively working with local people through democratic means towards restoration of landscapes. So basically turning deserts into greenlands again. SECAM is an example of an Egyptian company where we actually see that happening in Egypt, where in the Nile Delta. So where there's beyond that, where the desert is, that SECAM started a community and turning the desert into greenlands again, building a community around it. So if it's happening in Egypt, if it's happening in China, it can happen everywhere, I would say. So far, what I've been talking about has not been just my own work. It's a work that's always been collaborative with other people. And so this is just an overview of people that I've been publishing with over the last 12 years or so. And these people have been, of course, very influential in what I've been doing over the last 12 years. And this is just to show that research is not something that you do on your own, but it's always a collaborative effort. And I hope that in 5 years and 10 years or so, I can redraw this picture and fill it with your names here in Lincoln, just to show that all the research that we are doing here, developing new projects and so on, is being successful and a great achievement of all of us. So finally, I'm very happy to be here in Lincoln. It's a wonderful university. Thank you, Craig, for allowing me the opportunity to become a professor here. It's a great honor, and I look forward to work with you over the next years or so. Thank you. We can take questions now, if you like. Yes?
Yeah. It's a very interesting talk. A question, and maybe it's about semantics, but I was just wondering, you present your model with at the top dignity, and then you mentioned different kinds of dignity, so the employee dignity, environmental dignity, etc. You also mentioned something about goals, and I was thinking, do you really need the concept of dignity for all these different for all these different topics? Because to me, it also sounds like as an organization, you have specific goals, and each of these goals has a value attached to it. And if the value is larger, then that goal is more important. So now you can say the financial goal is most important because it has most value.
Yeah.
And is it not more that? And if you approach it from that way, then you could say, well, dignity is important when it's about employees. They can also see it for animals. For the environment, I would say it becomes a more difficult concept. And yeah, for the environment, I would say it's also a limited resource, which gives the environment now increasing value, which makes it important. And for employees, which in that case, you could say, dignity is just one of the drivers of the value for the goal, just as expertise or skills would be. So to place it on the same level, you place it as a central concept.
Yes. Yeah. It's it's an issue that I've been thinking about, obviously, over the last years as well. And this is all about the relationship between value and dignity. And it's a very Dutch discussion almost. I can show you basically why it is. Let me go here. This is my Dutch example. Paul, you've seen it before, right? Yeah. This is for my Dutch family as well. This is what dignity actually is in Dutch. So the Dutch term for dignity is waardigheid. And the nice thing about dignity, the Dutch term, is that it actually exists of 4 different words in terms in the Dutch version. So waardigheid consists and contains 4 aspects, namely waar, waarde, aarde, and aardigheid. So waarde is value. So value is one aspect of dignity. But dignity is not just about the value. Dignity is also about waar, which is true, the truth. Dignity is also about aard or aarde, which is nature, character. And dignity is also about aardigheid, so kindness, which is why I put this in. The theory here is that each of these elements are necessary but insufficient to postulate an alternative to what we're doing in business and organizations. So, for example, what we always have in the Dutch tradition, you have comedians who go on stage, and the Dutch culture is very much preaching-like. So comedians are not just telling funny stories as they do here in England, but in Netherlands they always have an underlying message. And the underlying message is often at the end of it, and basically that is around, okay, why can't we just be a little bit nicer towards each other? And of course we do know that is purely insufficient to give us a true sense of what is needed in the workplace and in social life. It is one aspect, but we also need to tell each other the truth. We also need to tell each other what are the values. Now, so that is a bit of the background of my thoughts around that, but let me go into your specific question. Because values can be culturally determined, can be based upon religion, and so on and so on. So we might defend a value that my religion tells me that I need to behave in this way or that way. Okay, so values can be based upon lots of different sources. But for me, in postulating dignity, that's not sufficient, because my values may, for example, tell me that I don't care about how I really should be treating animals, for example, because I have no relationship to animals. I don't care about animals, so I don't feel any duty towards them. So that could be resulting from my value system, for example. But for me, that's not enough. There's more, basically the idea that if we are acting, if we have a relationship towards something else, such as animals, we should respect their inherent dignity, which is calling for a duty, an acted duty of us towards the animal. And what that specific duty is, not clear. It's depending on context, but depending on situation. But that is also why I introduced the idea of the dialogue, which is, okay, we can only know what these duties are in this specific situation, in this context, when we start a dialogue with each other to talk about, okay, what is dignity actually meaning in this situation? So that has been my thought process over the last years in terms of the relationship between value and dignity. But of course, it's not a finalized process. You can read, for example, the last sentences of my book, in which I openly declare that we should be critical towards ourselves and each other. So if you have a better argument, please come up with one, so that we can build on a better theory. Yeah. So that's my true belief. Yeah. Paul is an MBA student, and I have had the pleasure of teaching Paul earlier, so it's a great pleasure to have you here, Paul.
My question is from a similar sort of thing, but from a sort of perhaps cold and nihilistic perspective, where dignity may be a human construct. What would you argue is the actual business benefits of implementing dignity?
Yeah, well, that is thanks, yeah, because that is around the question of dignity implementation. How can we actually convince, for example, business leaders of why they should be interested in dignity, right? There's one approach which I saw this week on the Dutch news, which was there was a trip being organized for business leaders to the North Pole to show how badly the climate change is affecting us. And they were all being affected so much. They had this nice trip, by the way, to North Pole, but then at the same time, they could see how bad everything was. So I don't think we should be naive in that sense and trying to convince people on the basis of arguments, on the basis of, you should really be doing this because look how bad climate change is going to affect us. I don't believe at all that is truly a changing business. It might be, but only if we're lucky. I have a much more radical approach, and that is the idea of organization itself is allowing this to sustain. So it was Aristotle himself, I think, who was arguing against the idea, there we go, of workplace democracy, or against the idea and pro-workplace democracy, basically, not true. But because if you allow a very small group of people to make all the relevant decisions within society and in organizations, that makes the system very unstable. And that was being said 2,000 years ago, and now we very well know how true these words are. So the only way in which we can sustain dignity, implement dignity in a much more viable way, is when we start to organizing ourselves in a much more democratic and bottom-up way. Because in society we don't allow authoritarian leaders, but in organizations we very well do. Why? I don't know. Yeah, but can I, yeah, it's family first.
I have a question, Matthijs. You talk about workplace dignity, and in the beginning you made a relation with the aging worker. Why? Is this a problem because we are becoming older? Is it the problem the same for the younger workers?
Yes. The practical reason is that my career started around the notion of, okay, the older worker. But at the same time, I was never really satisfied or I never felt comfortable with using the term older worker itself, because first of all, you talk about a group of people as being one. So so these were more intuitions about why it is just a silly discussion to talk about the older worker. But I was starting from there, so it also reflects my own development. But what you see in the literature and how it's been talked about as well, I think in many in the media and by consultants and so, is that it refers to a specific problem that we need to solve within organizations. Or the government talks about, okay, how can we make all the workers more employable, because too many of them are unemployed and they're unable to find new jobs. So how can we make them more employable? And all of these questions from a dignity perspective are just very limited. It does not address the real issue, and that is how can we ensure organizations to be truly inclusive, where we don't have to talk about age, where we don't have to talk about gender or race, but about, okay, what is the true purpose of organizations? And part of that is also that what we have done is we started to differentiate between organizations and people, as if organizations are entities that exist beyond or outside of people. But organizations are nothing empty without people. But we give them a life, basically. So that is, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Ted was first.
Just a comment on the older workers. I kind of figured out that the slide you showed with the 5 people, the 2 older workers are the ones sitting down. Sophisticated. Well, one comment. I'm not sure if you're aware that Sarah Shipley, who isn't here today because she's partying, I think, this weekend, is heading off to Bhutan. In the summer. Bhutan is a very small country, 750,000 population, up there in the Himalayas. And they have they are the leader in the World Happiness Index or something like that. And that manifests, so I understand, from kind of a very, very narrow understanding of their sense of dignity, of their sense of objects and animals and natural resources, all having inviolable worth, which is a fascinating case study. I think there's something to be learned from that. And some of the questions that were asked of you earlier kind of stimulated me to think about dignity, and you actually offer it to us in 2 different forms. One is an inherent form. Dignity is inherent in some way. Now, whether that's a construction or whether that's somehow real, is a question in itself, I think, methodologically. And then, but there's also a relational aspect to that. So you then began to talk about respect and duty, which is a relational quality of dignity. So there are 2 different qualities. There's an inherent quality, a relational quality. It made me wonder about, well, can you trade dignity then? Is there something, is there reciprocity involved? Can you enlarge dignity through reciprocal acts and through some kind of trading? It's just fascinating.
Yes. Yes, but I think, yeah, I totally agree. We talk about the promotion of dignity, about the protection of dignity as there is some lower threshold, and then we can contribute to greater dignity in the workplace. So there is certainly some questions to be asked around that, the specific nature. There is, of course, the classical distinction between earned dignity and inherent dignity, and which I did not touch upon. But this idea of earned dignity, that we, through our actions, we can earn dignity, we can become dignified, is something that has been existing in the thinking around dignity as well. Yeah.
And there are aspects of instrumentality in that too.
Yes, it's that's another question about, yeah, when you talk about goals, if you talk about instrumentality, then at the moment I have to refer to the idea of balance, because I haven't been able to really think through completely the idea, the relationship between instrumentality and dignity. That's just, to be honest, that's work to be done. Yeah, yeah, yes. Oh yes, yeah. Okay, define. Yeah.
I have a 600-person company, HR, so I live in the real world. I appreciate what you're saying, and I do use the phrase very quickly about the problem with the aging workforce. We have a problem. We have multiple problems with the aging workforce, but I can see in what you said that dignity could play a big part in it. Because my father's generation is, you are what you did. He found a real problem when he retired because he felt he lost his self-worth.
Yeah.
My son is not what he does. He's had 4 careers by the time he's 28 and has a different sense of self-worth. But we have a generation that's moving into an area where if they don't work, they have no self-worth. And we now need we have that, and I thought your picture of the Rolling Stones was very good, because I think we need honest conversations, and you were saying you don't have a conversation around gender and ethnicity or the rest of it. I think you need a conversation around aging, because there's a conversation around capability.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've got guys in the office who do put a lot back, but equally I've got guys digging holes and laying bricks, that by the time they're 58, they're shot.
Yeah.
Cannot do what they've always done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is a problem.
Yeah.
And I was interested in what you had to think about how dignity can.
Yeah. Well, I presume you are in the construction industry, or yeah, and this is one of the most interesting and I think also relevant context as well. If we talk about the relationship between aging workforce and dignity, because I think that the relevant question here is about, okay, how can we approach this specific issue from a dignified angle, and that is. We have to ask ourselves the question, can we allow people to start, for example, from the age of 17, 18 or 20 to work in construction industry and then being burnt out at the age of 45 or 50 and with their backs being broken and no longer able to do any work and having to retire because they are just not being able to work anymore from a physical perspective. And I think that demands that we have to ask ourselves a question: how can we make sure that these people can lead their working lives in a more dignified way? For example, and this is of course a very simple example, just to stimulate thinking. But what was happening in Amsterdam, for example, was that people were working in the construction industry, knowing that it's such a physical job. They were offered the opportunity to work at the construction site in the morning, and then in the afternoons they were driving taxis, because most of the demand for taxis is in the afternoon in Amsterdam. So that you could balance the physical burden of having to do these jobs with a somewhat less physical job. So it means that, and of course this is a very simplistic example, but it means that we have to get together, not just within industries, but across industries, and think about, okay, how can we make sure that people are not physically burned out at the age of 45 or 50, that we allow them to, even if they do not have the desire to be working until their 70s or whatever, but that they have at least the opportunities to lead a dignified working life. And so that's just the start of okay, can we think about those issues in other terms and in creative ways? Of course, we need to solve those kind of issues also in a creative way. Government, organizations, within across sectors, etc. You know.
Ladies and gentlemen, I think we probably do need to draw things to a close, because I suspect we could continue for a while yet on some of the. I mean, I've had a list of about a dozen questions that I wanted to ask Matthijs from his talk there. I just find it incredibly thought-provoking, some of the work that Matthijs is doing, and I was particularly interested in the insight that you had that actually dignity extends beyond simply the individual. I never really conceived of it in those sort of ways. So this is. It's raised a whole series of questions, which, and Matthijs, of course, is honest enough to admit that in some of them you're still exploring these.
Yes, of course.
And I'm frankly just delighted and honoured that he's chosen to explore some of these questions with us in the business school at London, because not only I think are they in and of themselves fascinating questions, but actually also they lie at the very heart of what we want to be and do as a business school. Not only is Matthijs the Professor of Responsible Management, but he's also leading a discussion which I think should and will infiltrate all of the work we do as a school over the coming years. So it just gives an element of the importance of this work to us. So Matthijs, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your lecture. Thank you for all of these thought-provoking comments. And I think we should show him all due respect for the work.
Thank you. Thank you.